Welcome to Tidepool Loop, how it works. It's a lovely little webinar we're going to host right now, talking about how Tidepool Loop works. Joining me, I'm Christopher Snyder, Tidepool's Community Clinic Success Manager. I have type 1 diabetes. My spouse also has it. I'm going to list these qualifications for everybody because that is not relevant, but important. Important, but relevant. I have a script, I promise. Saira Kangala, she is our Access and Equity Lead for Tidepool. She's also, and I wrote this down because it is really important, she is involved with labeling, training, and other critical documentation requirements for Tidepool Loop. She's one of the smartest people I know. She has type 1 diabetes, her spouse has type 1 diabetes, and her two children have type 1 diabetes. Also on the call is Pete Schwam, Tidepool Loop's technical lead. He's also the father of a child with type 1 diabetes. And then finally, Dr. Rehan Lal, he is our chief medical advisor. Dr. Lal is also, I wrote this one down to be precise, an adult and pediatric endocrinologist, engineer, physician scientist, also living with type 1 diabetes. Some of the smartest people I know are in this webinar here, and we're here to talk with you about what you need to know about Tidepool Loop. Across these three people, we're going to have you covered for the next 45-ish minutes. But before we get started, I do want to issue one, not quite disclaimer, but get some required paperwork out of the way. The goal of this session is to mainly focus on what healthcare providers need to know about Loop. We're focusing on things like how the system works and what the algorithm is capable of doing and how you're going to be interacting with that from the patient perspective. We will not be discussing timelines, nor will we be discussing device partnerships. That's a separate discussion. We will have it at the appropriate time. That said, I'm done talking now. Saira, can you help set our audience up and level set everybody? How did we get here with Tidepool Loop on on its way to commercial release?
Yeah, so level setting for everybody, Tidepool Loop is the automated insulin dosing system that Tidepool took through to the FDA. It is a fork of Loop that was built off from the Loop community, and its entire foundation is built off of the algorithm that exists, the open source algorithm. What we did is we gathered a ton of clinical evidence to kind of confirm that it was a safe system to be used. We took it through regulatory channels, gave it to the FDA, went through the entire process with them. And that is the clearance that we have right now for all things Tidepool Loop. As a process, essentially, we also have just for ongoing purposes of letting folks know how things work with Tidepool Loop is the any kind of features and functionality that we continue to iterate on as a patient-led company. The intention is to kind of listen to what we see the community wanting, and we'll have to go through the same process essentially of gathering that clinical evidence, going through our entire QMS, going through QA, design review processes, is everything that it kind of takes for us to get things that we see the community wants and get it through into the hands of people actually using it. So that's a little overview of just how we got here and how we will continue to iterate for all things Tidepool Loop. That kind of
Awesome.
answer everything.
That I think covers everything. We'll find out in the comments whenever they watch the archive later on. Let's get started with some of the finer details about Tidepool Loop. Pete, I'm going to start with you because this has been your bread and butter for quite some time. Patient choice is a big thing that we like to pride ourselves in focusing on at Tidepool, and in particular with Tidepool Loop, this is a pretty critical component of the customization of the Loop experience. There are a lot of knobs, there's a lot of options, there's just a lot that you can kind of dig into. It can be intimidating at a high level, but once you start to get into understanding the components of it, I obviously feel it's approachable, but I work here. I'm a little biased. I'm supposed to say that. But can you speak a little bit to the components of the settings and how that's going to be approached in terms of where the knobs are, if you will, for making Loop as customizable as possible?
Yeah, so Loop is, it does have a lot of settings, but we design it to try to be, as simple as possible, while still allowing some configuration and customization. It does inherit a lot of the standard settings that are familiar to people that have done pump therapy before. So you do have a mental model that's familiar to a lot of people coming into this. We organize it so that you have your insulin sensitivity, you have your carb sensitivity, you have your target ranges that you'd like to shoot for. All those are, the basics of the algorithm. The algorithm does its job every 5 minutes to try to do that. It's a pretty simple setup, but it ends up being very powerful.
Dr. Law, the one setting in particular that I it's taking me a bit of time to wrap my head around is the glucose safety limit. That one in particular, as you're sort of thinking about the rest of the components, if you want to chime in on anything else that Pete might have mentioned, but that one in particular, I'm curious your perspective on that and how you explain that to other clinicians that are talking to you about the loop algorithm.
Great question, Chris. And I want to emphasize again what Pete said is basically these are familiar settings in a lot of ways to people, but there are some things that industry folks will do and sort of they are there, but they're just not something that we can set or we can play with. So glucose safety limit is a very simple safety setting that if the actual or predicted glucose falls below this glucose safety limit, I'm just going to suspend all insulin delivery, meaning at this stage, I'm really worried, things are going to go further or I'm going to have real low symptomatology. And so I just want to turn everything off for a moment until I am at or predicted to be above that value.
Right on. Pete, there are two in particular correction ranges that I'd like your comment on. We have this sort of standard operating procedure. Is it normal mode? But I know the low target there can go as low as 87, but pre-meal and workout targets. Can you speak a little bit to where that factors into the configuration of Loop?
Yeah, so pre-meal kind of is a temporary preset that you can enact that will change your target level. So for a short period of time, usually before meals, you enact this. It will let Loop target a slightly lower BG level, and that's because you are going to be eating soon. It's safer to target a little a lower level, and Loop can get a little bit more insulin on board because insulin is such a slow acting thing. It's really helpful to get that little bit of insulin before you actually start eating and before your actual meal bolus. So that's pre-meal. Workout is kind of for the opposite situation where you are probably going to be more at risk of going low. And so you do want Loop to be targeting a higher thing, keeping you safe, keeping your blood sugar in a healthy range.
Right on. Dr. Law, there are a couple of other settings I just want to make sure we speak to directly. Max basal rate, max bolus, those are pretty standard components from my perspective as a pump user myself. But as you think about those two and the rest of the, so like you said, the visibility to all the different pieces, what do you feel is the best opportunity for clinicians to really understand the uniqueness of how Loop operates? Is it that the glucose safety limit is a visible thing, or is there some other component around those settings and the interaction with the settings that you feel is something that clinicians should really keep an eye on as they are being mindful of what Loop is possible of doing?
And I think the other thing, Chris, I'll just comment on what Pete was saying and where this can be important, especially for that pre-meal target, is let's assume someone overnight oftentimes is very insulin sensitive by comparison. They may fall below their glucose safety limit and then they're going on, a suspended insulin for a little while. And then they wake up, they're very insulin resistant, and they're going to eat breakfast. That's a really good place where getting some insulin on board after a period of suspension can be super useful. So that's a really good time where I've seen people have some success using that. With respect to the maximum deliveries, this is again something where some of the industry folks have just said, we will not accept a basal for automation that is greater than a certain multiplier of the scheduled basal. And one of the things that has irked me about that for systems that do basal modulation as their mechanism of automation, and whether you call it a basal or bolus is almost immaterial here. Insulin delivery is insulin delivery. But the reality is, if I really need insulin, the time when I'm going to need it is, whoops, I forgot to bolus, or I forgot to really get the insulin in that I needed at a time where I had the greatest insulin need. So with the customizations available in Tidepool Loop, we actually allow you to increase that max basal limit to a point where if you did have an uncovered meal, that basal could get high enough to help you cover for that missed meal. And I think that's something to just be aware of, is that making it a certain multiplier of your basal rate doesn't always make sense for filling in the gap when there is a missed dose. And therefore, it's nice to be able to have that ability to perhaps set it a little bit higher than that. And with respect to max bolus, this is again just another safety feature as we would have in any other system. If you're trying to enter a bolus of 10 units and your finger slips, you don't want it to be 100 units.
Makes sense. While we were talking about all the different sort of components, knobs, if you will, I feel like that's the unofficial term. I did kind of fly through the part where the low target can go as low as 87. Syra, do you want to offer a little context for how we arrived at that number specifically?
Yeah, and kind of one of the things we spoke to earlier is needing to have had clinical evidence to validate that that was a safe target is where we landed on that. So through all the clinical evidence that we worked through in the observational study that we had conducted of users on the loop algorithm, targeting as low as 87 was safe without causing any severe adverse reactions. So that was where we landed on for that. Pete and Rayhan, let me know if I answered that accurately.
Yeah. Yeah, it's there are a variety of people have different needs, and I think some of the settings currently don't support people that do have a need to set a lower target. And so it was great that we were able to do that.
Yeah, having the data to validate that for our FDA clearance I was surprised because I'm in the meetings, but I see the notes come through. It's like, oh no, this is what we're submitting and this is what we got cleared. Fantastic stuff. One of the big questions I received, so we're recording this and you can kind of see on my little calendar over here, September 9, 2024, or the past few months when I've been at diabetes conferences with clinicians who are asking about various components of Loop, specifically about the algorithm and the duration of insulin, the insulin model, and the sort of forecasting timeline. I might be incorrectly bundling those, but I felt like that was a set of questions that I was hearing consistently from clinicians that were asking about how the loop algorithm is going to work and what to expect in terms of the performance and the timing mechanisms of that. So I'm not sure if you want to address all three of these together or if you want to piece them out. Again, we're talking about the forecasting window as well as the duration of insulin and insulin model. Pete, I'm going to start with you. You can pick from the menu there. We can cross some things off as we go.
Sure. Yeah. A lot of people are surprised by the 6-hour window. And a lot of people historically have thought of insulin as kind of having like a 3-hour or even shorter duration. But I think a lot of those systems were kind of compressing the bulk of insulin action up into a short period. And when you're, dosing manually, that's not such a problem. But the longer tail of insulin is really important to consider when you are automating dosing and you're doing lots of small doses over time, because those tails can add up. And so, Loop does have basically a 6-hour duration of insulin action that is also what it bases the forecast off of. So we plot out what we think are the effects of insulin over those 6 hours, and that gets incorporated in forecast. And that's what Loop is trying to manage. It sees if that forecast is going to end up bringing you high, then we would like to add more insulin and conversely reduce insulin if it looks like you're going low. But we do consider that the whole timeline there.
Okay.
That's where it comes from.
Yeah. Dr. Lau, thoughts on the insulin model?
This is a really, if you talk to people who actually do insulin ELISAs on individuals, this is a fairly easy question. There is no ultra rapid insulin that is injected subcutaneously that is 3 to 4 hours in action. If you measure insulin levels after giving a bolus, it almost always will go out to 5, 6.5 hours sometimes. And people are slightly variable depending on where you inject them, what the absorption is. But the reality is 6 hours is much closer to reality than 3 or 4. 3 or 4 came out of some simplifications that were used in bolus calculators back when those became a thing. And really, they reflected the portion of the insulin curve that decayed linearly without respect to the tail effect. And again, as Pete mentioned, If you are trying to deliver insulin to correct a high blood sugar, it might be okay to do a little insulin stacking and let those tails add up on top of one another. But when you are trying to model the behavior of insulin, you really do need a true pharmacodynamic plot. What is the effect of insulin on glucose?
This is loop related, but also I'm just curious because I don't get to be in too many meetings with you, Dr. Lal. How do you wrap your head around that clinical evidence and the sort of technical level of, detailed discussion, analysis, and everything that you have to synthesize and translate that into something that's actionable for your patients? I know we're talking about Tidepool Loop, not yet commercially available. It will be at some point. Obviously, we'll have a lot to say about that. But just generally speaking, as you are taking in all of that highly technical information and then putting it out into something that is again actionable for your patients, how do you go about determining either how to translate it or what is most important for your patients to know? I'm curious about that.
It's really interesting because the engineers at other industry partners have to make decisions someplace or the other. And in some systems, this idea that insulin acts over 5, 6+ hours, that is still encoded in the fundamentals of their systems. But they include an active insulin time fudge factor, which is not even, it has absolutely no relationship to the actual activity of insulin. So I have to remind people that just because they used a fudge factor for their prior system does not necessarily mean that it changes the underlying physiology of the drug, right? So the good news is I can, in some cases, if I've done one of these experiments on an individual, I can actually show them their true pharmacodynamic curve and illustrate to them, actually, yes, this is acting over that period. That tends to be the most convincing. But if you don't have access to those resources, you can always use a population level curve to just show the person that on average, this is the effect, and they shouldn't feel wary that another term which was not truly reflective of the pharmacodynamics of the drug was a little bit shorter than what they're seeing here. And the reality is, again, that there a couple of these industry partners asking people to set active insulin time to 2-3 hours. They are thinking of eventually getting rid of that as a settable setting because it just doesn't make sense as a setting anymore.
Okay. So I haven't looked in user manuals recently, but like the insulin fudge factor, that's like a fun little I don't know. I feel like you'd find that like in the index, the appendix of the index somewhere if you're looking really closely and all the finer details of things. Negative insulin on board is a fascinating concept that once I wrapped my head around it, made a ton of sense. But I feel that this may be new for some folks that are either new to automated insulin dosing or in particular will likely be new to Tidepool Loop. Pete, we'll start with you. What's your perspective on how you explain what negative insulin on board means?
Yeah, I can definitely see it being confusing. It's the idea of negative insulin obviously doesn't make sense in itself. What that represents in Loop is the idea that you have had less insulin than your scheduled, insulin schedule would have given you. And so what we have there is kind of a negative effect. Like if carbs do come on board and there's not insulin there, there's going to be a positive effect with respect to the amount of insulin that you would normally have for that. And that does take some time to kind of, that negative balance does take some time to clear. So it usually happens in situations where you've been, Loop has reduced your basal for a period of time and all your active insulin has expired and you're actually now having less insulin than you would on board than you would if you were just running your scheduled basal rate.
One quick follow-up on that, Pete,
Yeah.
because I know you are in these critical meetings where we're talking about the user interface and what information is provided on which screen, and sort of how this is going to be communicated across training, user guides and all the things like that. For something, we just use negative insulin on board as an example here, but what has been your perspective on our process to evaluating that sort of decision point of where information is disclosed and how much detail is too much versus not enough? Because again, I know from the outside, it's a really thorough back and forth and a really considerate process, but I'm just curious if you'd be able to share what's your perspective on how we go about evaluating like where information is shared and how we go about sort of thinking about the user personas with respect to the different pieces of how Tidepool Loop works.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. That's a very, very cool thing that we do here, I think, is that we actually put these user interfaces in front of people and see if they can do the tasks that they wanted, that they would like to do with Loop, and see where where they might have trouble, or if there's some missing information, or if they're reading some part of the UI in a way that we didn't expect, which does happen. You design something and you think that you're communicating one thing, but you see that people are receiving it a different way. And that informs us and allows us to go back and review and make changes that make the interface more simple and more easy to understand for people. So I really love that aspect at Tidepool.
And on that note, that's also part of what we have to send to the FDA is like, hey, this is why we built it this way, and users actually used it the way that we intended for it to be used as well and understood it. So super quick note, slightly tangentially related, but Christopher, you started with like, here's all these knobs, and Rehan, I know you talked a lot about like how other systems work, and I just wanted to kind of tie it back to how important all those different settings are, especially when you are getting a patient started and when you are going through optimization and that sort of thing, right? Every system that currently exists has different pieces that they want clinicians and users to focus on adjusting, and so kind of level setting on how important all the different knobs are is one thing I wanted you to be able to kind of touch on.
Yeah, I do want to mention that we see a lot of focus, especially on things like correction range, right? So people get really worked up about how low does that correction range go. The reality is it is no single setting that makes the difference here. It is really the sum of all of the settings that work together to affect system aggressiveness and system performance. And even if something is way off, if you have a backup like the glucose safety threshold, which is there to sort of make sure that, okay, even if everything else is set wrong, if I see an actual or predicted less than this limit, I'm going to turn off all insulin. Those things work together to really help you. So I think that's the most important takeaway for me, is it's not one single setting, but it's really the combination of settings. So you should of course do things within the physiology that you understand and know, but realize that even if you make some dreadful mistake, there are other settings in there which will help significantly to offset these things. If you guys want a real world example, at one point, I was sending people ISF values and saying 1 unit colon so many milligrams per deciliter. And then they decided, okay, that colon actually represented a decimal point. So instead of saying my ISF was 1 to 30, it was 1.3. And the reality is that because that glucose safety limit is there, and max bolus, max basal, all of these other things, even though you set a really aggressive ISF, guess what? The system can pull back as needed, and you will have the ability to then see what has happened and help troubleshoot that.
I think that was also helpful from the loop up from our observational study, is that we assume, because it was a real world study, we had some wildly off settings, right? It wasn't like all the data that we're presenting was with users with really refined settings that were developed, with a, so being able to prove that even with those inaccurate settings, we were able to safely target what we have in there.
Yeah, the real world has a lot of interesting, like, there's a lot more messy place than a lot of clinical trials, I think, which is awesome that we were able to prove safety and that kind of thing, or show safety.
One of the very interesting things we saw in there is that some people didn't set a glucose safety limit at all, and so there's a lot of things that people do that we wouldn't expect, but they do happen, and then that helps us learn. And additionally, all of that data and data from users can also help us with the initialization of some of these settings. So we really are trying to work on that aspect as well.
Maybe I can bring up another point about settings, and that's, there are systems that, try to simplify things maybe a little bit too much. And, I think, ultimately we all want a system that has no settings and we just, live our lives, but we're not quite at that point with, how much variation goes on and how slow insulin is. But what ends up happening in these systems where you don't have much to modify, you end up changing weird things. Like you end up changing insulin duration to try to account for other sorts of things that you can't change, or you enter in fake data to try to make up for this lack of configuration. So, that is one of the advantages of, being able to set more things inside Tidepool Loop.
That is a great point, actually, to highlight in terms of the mental model that comes with managing diabetes. And again, Tidepool Loop is not yet available, but as we think about what training is going to look like, what it's going to take to educate clinicians on what all the knobs are, and then have those clinicians educate their patients on what the knobs are, I feel like there's going to be a lot of undocumented labor around sort of dismantling what you might have been doing as like a crutch, or as a way that you sort of accommodated your own diabetes management because you felt that there was an access point or a mechanism that was out of reach to you, either for one reason or another, but that would be available to you within Tidepool Loop because we have the longer list of settings that are available, because of the customization that's available, because of some of the other things we're about to get to with some of the novel features of Tidepool Loop. But I think we're obviously going to see how all that's going to go. We're going to be able to iterate hopefully pretty quickly on aspects where we need to. But when I think about that training aspect, not just from Tidepool to the clinician or Tidepool to the patient, but the clinician to the patient, and understanding, hey, like, some of these things, what an insulin to carb ratio is, hopefully for some of you that are already on an insulin pump, but here's how we're going to now interpret that potentially known component in the Tidepool Loop framework. It's an exciting thing for us to tackle. I'm excited to obviously see how it's going to break out. But Dr. Law, again, I come back to you as the clinician in the room. When you think about applying known knowledge about pump therapy and how that may apply to Tidepool Loop or may not apply to Tidepool Loop, are there any things that stand out to you there around sort of where the Venn diagram, sort of separates, if you will?
Yeah, I think to me, the biggest thing is there are oftentimes frustrations in commercial systems. I want to make this more aggressive, or I want to make this more weak. And like Pete was saying, you find replacement knobs when you don't have direct access. So for me, knowing that if I change the ISF, I am literally changing the aggressiveness of the controller. That's really helpful, because if somebody starts to oscillate up and down because they're having a lot of lows, then I take my foot off the gas and I hit the brakes. If I'm in a situation where the system is just never bringing me down, then I assess, is this immediate post-meal issue, in which case I can play with carb ratio as I can in most systems, but then I can also look at the later behaviors. Does it correct things down over the longer term? And I can hit the accelerator if it's not doing enough.
Right on. All right, I want to talk a little bit about novel features, but I want to make sure everybody's good. Pete, are you good on the settings conversation before we move on?
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things you mentioned about bringing in settings from an older, or bringing in concepts from an existing system. We can sometimes call that's a transfer. Sometimes it can be a negative transfer. we do have an onboarding system that goes through a lot of the stuff that actually, does give people a lot more guidance as you come to Loop, and hopefully, help introduce you to those concepts as you're coming from other systems. So I think that's another cool part that Tidepool developed.
And those are things that we've built to account for people that have been previously on automated insulin dosing, regular pump therapy, or maybe never been on a pump before. Again, I've seen some of the conversation around the validation around that. It's really, really exciting. Speaking of exciting, 2 novel features I want to highlight. Pete, I don't know if you actually have a live demo ready for us, but I'm going to keep filling time in case you do. The thing that I get to show off the most often, especially at conferences, is carb entry, especially with the emojis. You want to talk a little bit about how food is entered into Tidepool Loop and what that entire whole ordeal is about? Because it's definitely novel for me.
I can give a little walkthrough about how Loop comes up with a dose for, let's say you're entering carbs. You guys can see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is 30 grams of carbs that were entered. And this little simulator just kind of shows how Loop comes up with, a dose. Like if we assume that there's no insulin given, Loop thinks that your BG is going to rise with those carbs, and you're going to end up at 200 in this case based on these settings. So it does kind of an iterative process where it increases the amount that it would dose. And this shows that dashed line that this is the prediction as you dose more. And you can see we start to get down into range here. And 0.75 is actually the recommended bolus. We have like a dosing safety threshold that we were talking about earlier here. If any part drops below that, obviously, if to get you in range, it would come down here, this would automatically shut off if you had enough carbs that, Loop thought that you would get more insulin. So, yeah, so this is basically the Loop algorithm deciding how to figure out how much insulin to give. I don't know if you want to see an actual the carb entry interface itself. All right, so this is a very blank slate here. I just started up this simulator, so there's no insulin data or anything at this point. But yeah, if we wanted to enter a meal, we can enter in, we click on the carb entry button at the bottom there, and let's say we're going to do 30 grams again. One of the unique things about Tidepool Loop is that you can actually pre-enter meals. So you could, if you're not going to eat right now, but you are going to eat a little, let's say you're going to eat 15 minutes out into the future, you can click that plus button once, or maybe even half an hour. Click the plus button twice, and you're out at half an hour from now. You're going to eat. So this allows you to tell Loop that you're going to eat. Loop can start giving you more insulin ahead of the game to get the insulin going earlier. And you can select, basically, you can also give Loop a hint. This is not required, but in addition to saying how much you're eating, you can also tell Loop roughly how long you expect it to take to absorb. So if you're eating something like pizza, that is something that could be absorbing for quite a while. If it's something very sugary and not a lot of fat or protein, you're going to expect that to affect your blood sugar really fast and be kind of out of your system quickly. So this gives Loop a hint as to how it's going to go. If you can use this to communicate all sorts of things. If these emojis get sent around the system and into the Tidepool backend as well for display at some point. But you can select a different emoji to represent your food choices. Let's just say we're doing apples here. So once you've entered that, so that ended up being a pretty quick absorbing food. We said that it was going to take 30 minutes to absorb. So you can kind of see that there's a sharp increase over 30 minutes here in the future. Loop will now calculate a recommendation based on the amount of carbs that you entered. And this gives you an example, including the dosing of, what would happen if you actually took that dose. So let's say that we didn't dose anything. It's going to show your prediction. This is what Loop thinks is going to happen. In a half an hour when you eat that food, it's going to send your blood sugar sky high, and you're just going to stay there because you don't have insulin. If you think you maybe want to be a little bit, you don't want to take Loop's recommendation, you can adjust this. So you can do it a little bit down. This will give you, maybe sometimes you eat these apples and you don't think you see the full amount of carbs hit. So you can bump that down a little bit. Once you've decided that everything looks good, you can save and deliver. Enter in a code to make sure that it's you that's actually delivering this bolus. And then you get a notification that loop is bolusing, and you can see the updated forecast here. Yeah.
Oh, shoot, Pete, I forgot. I actually only ate 15 grams.
Oh, okay. Yep. So now if we go to the, we can go to a list of see what past entries you've entered for carbs, and you can actually even edit this. So instead of 30, we're gonna say we're only half the apple, so we're gonna do 15 grams. I can save this. Loop is saying, you already have enough insulin that maybe you should actually eat some more, or you can cancel this bolus as it's going mid bolus. And now we've actually kind of brought the insulin back up to where it should be, or brought your forecast back up to where we think it's safe. So you have less insulin delivered now. You've told Loop that you're going to eat less, and Loop can continue, trying to manage your BG, knowing as much information as you've been able to give it, and you haven't been kind of held into that mistake that you made in the past. You've been able to change that. So
I call that scenario the toddler temper tantrum, and you bolus for breakfast and they get upset halfway through and then they
yes.
throw that tantrum. You've already declared the carbs and bolus for that full amount. But if you were able to go in with Tidepool Loop, edit that carb entry, then Loop then knows that, hey, it needs to be paying attention to fewer carbs despite the insulin that was previously bolused. The toddler temper tantrum. The trademark is pending. It might not actually make it to the user guide, but that's still the scenario I like to communicate there. Dr. Lull, as Pete was showing off part of that carb entry, there was the emoji and the food absorption that was a key, in my opinion, differentiator from other systems that are currently on the market. You are not a nutritionist, nor are you a diabetes educator in the weeds like some of those folks may be, but as you think about the process of getting a patient to engage with their diabetes on that level, carb counting is one thing, but then thinking about the types of carbs is another. Are there any considerations that you're thinking about or that you'd like other clinicians to keep in mind as they're preparing for the eventual future where Tidepool Loop is out in the world?
Yeah, honestly, I think we do get a good number of questions, when should we be using what icons? And I also want us to realize that at the end of the day, our stomach is like a nice food store and blender. So what that means is, if you're mixing slow absorbing, fast absorbing stuff, it's probably going to end up somewhere on the medium to slow side. And just realizing that, if you ate a lollipop in addition to your sandwich, you don't have to announce those separately or, do multiple entries for that. I like to use the lollipop, particularly when telling the system about low treatments, stuff that absorbs very quickly, taco in most of the cases, and then pizza for really those high fat, high protein type meals where there's a lot to digest. But laws of averages, you can pick the one most representative of the current bolus of food.
Right on. So as we're starting to round out our discussion today, I do want to talk a little bit about around this sort of perception. And again, this is something that I've heard from clinicians when I'm speaking with them at diabetes conferences around who Loop may be for. The sort of the origin story of Tidepool Loop includes a community-driven aspect that was a little more tech forward, tech focused in terms of the perception of the type of people who may be best to approach the looping experience. As you think about, again, the future where Tidepool Loop is a reality, is there anybody that Tidepool Loop is not ideal for? Like who are you thinking about as you make the different sort of scenarios of patients that you may be seeing or currently see, and as you evaluate whether or not Tidepool Loop would be an ideal opportunity for them and their diabetes management? How do you approach that sort of perception where, there may be some sort of a potential stigma, if you will, around the use of Loop and whether or not that may be an ideal fit for them and their diabetes management needs?
I think in the open source space, there's always been this conflation of if it's tough to set up, it must be tough to use. And those things are very separate. And I think Tidepool's done a tremendous job of trying to make this something that more people can have access to. And in my mind, the most important thing amongst the biomedical ethical principles that we as healthcare providers deal with is being able to have a thorough risk-benefit discussion of all the alternatives out there. And I think it's more a question of having an informed discussion with people. These are the things that are great about this system. These are the limitations. And then you give them all the options. And honestly, I mean, for many people, it's less about the algorithm and more about just the system usability, you know, which pump is it, which sensor is it? And so it may come down to factors like that, but unless we give people the option and make it accessible, it's off the table. So I will say from my experience with over 4,000 people using open source systems, they are very much not all coming from an overserved background. We have field workers on some of these systems, long-haul truck drivers. You know, this is something that everybody can benefit from if given the opportunity. And I think that's what Tidepool has done, is hopefully given more people that opportunity.
Pete, from the design and then the development perspective, again, you're part of all of those key discussions around what moves forward, how it moves forward, what it looks like, and what those interactions are going to be. How do you think about that sort of approachability of Loop as it goes into the discussions that you're part of, the decisions that are being made around how Tidepool Loop is going to work moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, design is crucial, you know, to making systems usable. And Tidepool Loop, and even, you know, coming from the community version of Loop, like design has been an important thing. And, you know, there are complicated aspects to diabetes. Like diabetes itself is complex, right? Like there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of stuff affects your diabetes. And we're trying to design a product that helps you manage that complex situation. And there's a lot to think about. But we do put a lot of energy into making it as simple as we can. And not, you know, not prematurely by hiding things that you probably do need to still be able to adjust.
And I'll just say there's no more beautiful interface. I think perhaps someone might challenge me on this, but the iconography, the way things are set up, it really is just a beautiful system to use.
I mean, we are all biased. You know, we've got at tidepool.org on our email addresses, so we're going to go from there. Pete, one follow-up on the other novel feature that I know that you feel very passionately about, the watch. You can bolus from an Apple Watch with this thing, which, again, when I first learned about all the different ins and outs, honestly, actually didn't connect with me right away until I saw somebody demo the experience for me through a simulator, like actually walk me through the reality of what it meant. So from your perspective, what's going on with the watch and how it's going to fit into how Tidepool Loop is going to work?
Yeah, I think the watch is another example of being able to use the things that are available and design a system that works really well. Like, you know, one of the use cases we see is people that are in situations where they would want to be able to do things and not be like taking out a medical device and, you know, everybody stops and look at it like in a classroom setting, or, you know, you're in a conference of some sort. And like Tidepool Loop, you know, with its watch interface allows you to be very discreet and to, you know, it looks like you might be just taking care of a calendar appointment or something. And really you're actually managing your type 1, you know, not just from being able to bolus, but seeing what your current amount of insulin is, what your, you know, how your carbs are absorbing. You can see what your forecasted glucose is. You can also even enact other presets like pre-meal or activity mode if you're going to go for a run. And these all just happen just, you know, looking at your watch and tapping. So I think that's a huge use case for I mean, anybody who is willing to wear a watch, I think, and has type 1, like, can benefit from this. But some people particularly so, it makes situations that, were incredibly awkward before, bearable. So I think it's a very important part of Tidepool Loop.
I should probably admit my bias here because I have an Android phone hanging out down here, so I don't have an Apple Watch. So that immediate convenience of the discrete nature, being able to manage your diabetes from the comfort of your wrist, didn't connect with me because I hadn't thought of it because I don't use it. But knowing that we are working on an Android version of Tidepool Loop gives me hope for the future too. So I'm in that Slack channel too as we move forward on that. Syra, did I leave any questions out? Because you actually helped me set the agenda for this conversation before we move to closing thoughts.
Yeah, one of the questions we got a lot, Rehan, from clinicians was, what is the minimum total daily dose required to use Loop? And so I think that kind of goes back to this question of like, as prescribers, as clinicians, what considerations they might have before prescribing. So can you walk through that answer? And then I have a follow-up to it as well.
Yeah, so there are some things that are perhaps more relevant to the hardware than the algorithm itself. The algorithm would gladly deliver teeny tiny quantities, but not all pumps are capable of delivering small volumes of insulin or the volumes of insulin that we would like. And so one does have to look at what the clearance is for the specific pump model. If it's really challenging to deliver very low volumes, then the younger population may have more issues with those devices. But there are other options, although they would take more regulatory clearance, such as dilute insulins and what have you. So what I would say is, generally speaking, though, people who are probably cleared by age, most of those requirements would be probably the most representative. So the age limits we have on the clearance would probably dictate sort of that lower limit on insulin doses, just because people in the age bracket have certain requirements.
So, and on that note, Tidepool Loop is cleared for ages 6 and over. Our different device partners will have to look at that when you're thinking about all the different use cases. And then I guess on that note, just thinking through, tying it back to the different knobs that are available and thinking through use cases where that may help you determine users that it's a better fit for, right? So for example, some of the use cases I've talked through with clinicians is like users that maybe have fears of hypo, right? So maybe targeting a little bit higher is where, we have a pretty wide range. You can target anywhere from 87 to 180, for example. And I think most people are like, well, why would I target 180? That's not what you see in other commercially available systems. And it gets back to that concept of you as a clinician being able to partner with your patients on giving them the options that make the most sense for them and then picking a solution that works for them. And so as a clinician, knowing, hey, here's all these customizations, here's all the ranges that are available in Tidepool Loop, and then looking at your patient population and saying, hey, I need that customization for these use cases, depending on what their needs are, is kind of what we wanted to go back to answer that question. I guess any other nuances you wanted to highlight there as a clinician on having the ability to decide what is a good fit for your patient and what you present as an option as compared to being like, well, here's what these systems can do, right? It's kind of, I think, a different conversation that you get to have with your potential prescribed patients.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is there are certainly situations where you're not going to want to start everyone at 87, and having that leeway a little bit higher also means that if somebody is really having problems with lower set points, you give them the option, and you as a provider have the option. So again, I think the whole thing here is give people and providers choices.
I like that. Pete, I'm going to give you the last word or give you a final thought as we start to round out of here. Aside from getting this thing out the door, Is there anything in particular you're excited for as we work our way to commercial release as it relates to Tidepool Loop, either internally as part of the the development team or externally when actual insulin is going to be going into people controlled by this application?
Yeah, I'm super excited about the things that we're looking into as far as helping people with their settings and helping be able to recommend settings and improving the loop algorithm itself to better, handle kind of the excursions that we see. There is a lot of opportunity, I think, ahead in that space, and I'm super excited that we're looking at some of that stuff for Tidepool Loop.
Yeah. One of which is a care partner experience, which we are working on and we intend to have available with Tidepool Loop's commercial release, Syra, as a caregiver of a child, 2 children with diabetes. Thoughts on that as you offer your closing thought for this discussion?
Yeah, that is a decision maker as a parent, is knowing, when your child, especially if you have a child that is going to school, knowing that they are safe when they are not in your hands is a pretty big deal. So I know our intention is to launch Tidepool Loop with a feature that allows you as a caregiver to see what's going on with whoever it is that you're caring for. So I'm really excited about that feature, and it's obviously really, really, really close to me, where I have a lot of opinions on it. And thankfully, the development team has not had to deal with my opinions too much yet.
And for me, my thing I'm most looking forward to is for the people that are watching this video and have no idea who Tidepool is, but you can go to tidepool.org/loop, and there's a little box you can put your email address in if you want to hear updates from us, like when Tidepool Loop is going to be released, what devices will be compatible with, other fun announcements like the Android version where we have more to say about that. Tidepool.org/loop. That's my favorite thing, because I'm going to say it one more time, rule of threes, tidepool.org/loop for more information. That's all I've got. That's all we've got. This is how it works. This is the first of what I imagine to be many conversations around Tidepool Loop and the Loop experience. I look forward to being one of the many people sort of shepherding that discussion and presenting all of the fun details to you all in the community watching this. So thank you for your support thus far, and hopefully we'll see you around at another one of these in the future. Again, tidepool.org/loop. Rule of fours, why not? Have a good day, everybody, and take care.